In the spring of 1995, in a quiet town in Ohio, a police officer's wife vanished without warning, and the case quickly went cold. But 18 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The town of Ridgewood, Ohio, was the kind of place where law enforcement officers were known by their first names. Nestled deeply among the dense, rolling forests of the Midwest, it was a community built on trust, quiet neighborhoods, and routine. For 34-year-old Ethan Walker, Ridgewood was not just the town he was sworn to protect. It was his entire world. Ethan was a deeply respected patrol sergeant with the local police department. He was a man defined by his quiet integrity, a sharp, analytical mind, and a fierce, unwavering dedication to his badge. But the true center of Ethan's world was his 32-year-old wife, Claire. Claire was a brilliantly organized, highly observant woman who worked as a records archivist down at the county courthouse. She had a warm, infectious smile and a deeply analytical mind that rivaled her husband's. She was the one person who could make Ethan leave the heavy burden of his badge at the front door. They were a completely inseparable team, building a quiet, beautiful life together in a small suburban home. But the inherent danger of wearing a police uniform is that the darkness you fight on the streets always knows exactly where you live. The terrifying chain of events began on a humid afternoon in the early spring of 1995. Ethan and his partner responded to a highly volatile, violent disturbance at a local tavern. The man tearing the place apart was Ray Nolan. Ray was a massive, deeply violent repeat offender who had spent the last decade terrorizing the community. He was a local menace, known for extreme aggression and a long history of severe assaults. When Ethan walked through the shattered front doors of the tavern, Ray refused to back down. The physical altercation was brutal, but Ethan's tactical training ultimately prevailed. He successfully pinned the massive man to the floor, securing the heavy steel handcuffs around Ray's wrists. As Ethan and his deputies marched the bleeding, furious offender out into the bright sunlight toward the waiting police cruiser, the chaotic crowd of onlookers fell completely silent. Ray stopped walking. He did not yell. He did not thrash against the officers. He slowly turned his head, locking his dark, cold eyes directly onto Ethan's face. A chilling, deeply sinister smile crept across Ray's mouth. He leaned forward and spoke in a quiet, rough whisper that only Ethan could hear. "One day, you'll know what it's like to lose absolutely everything." Most of the younger officers standing nearby simply laughed the comment off, completely dismissing it as the empty, desperate threat of a man heading back to a concrete prison cell. But Ethan didn't laugh. A heavy, sickening chill washed completely over his chest. He had looked into the eyes of hundreds of desperate criminals during his career, but the absolute, chilling certainty in Ray Nolan's voice felt entirely different. It sounded exactly like a deeply calculated promise. Ray Nolan was formally charged, convicted, and sent directly to a maximum security state penitentiary to serve a long, heavily restricted sentence. Ethan desperately tried to put the chilling threat behind him, focusing on his wife and his quiet life. But just a few weeks after the prison doors slammed shut on Ray Nolan, the secure, peaceful illusion of Ethan and Claire's life began to slowly, terrifyingly fracture. It started with a completely unfamiliar vehicle. One crisp Tuesday morning, while Ethan was working an early patrol shift, Claire was sitting at her kitchen table drinking a cup of hot coffee. She looked out the large front window and noticed a dark, heavily rusted pickup truck parked awkwardly near the edge of their quiet suburban street. The engine was completely turned off, but a dark figure was sitting motionless behind the steering wheel. Claire was an incredibly observant woman. She knew every single vehicle in their neighborhood. The dark truck did not belong there. When Ethan came home that evening, Claire mentioned the strange truck. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but she explained that it had been parked there for nearly 2 hours before quietly driving away. Ethan immediately took it seriously. He called the local dispatch and asked a patrol car to keep a close watch on his street. But by the time the marked police cruisers slowly rolled through the neighborhood the next morning, the dark truck had completely vanished. A few days later, the psychological intimidation rapidly escalated. Claire began receiving highly disturbing, silent phone calls on their home landline. The heavy plastic telephone would ring late in the evening. When Claire answered, expecting to hear her sister or a friend, the line would be completely silent. She would say hello, desperately waiting for a response, but the caller absolutely never spoke. All she could hear was the faint, hollow sound of static, followed by a sharp, heavy click as the person on the other end slowly hung up the receiver. Ethan tried to have the local telephone company trace the incoming calls, but the technology in 1995 was incredibly slow and deeply limited. The calls were originating from public, coin-operated payphones scattered completely across the county, making the phantom caller entirely untraceable. The invisible pressure began taking a massive, terrifying toll on Claire. The vibrant, highly organized woman became deeply anxious. She started double-locking the heavy wooden doors in the middle of the day. She closed the curtains before the sun went down. The absolute breaking point occurred exactly 4 days before the nightmare reached its climax. Claire met her older sister, Maggie, for a quick lunch at a small diner near the local grocery store. Maggie immediately noticed how pale and completely exhausted Claire looked. Claire kept nervously glancing over her shoulder, constantly checking the large glass windows of the diner. When Maggie gently asked what was wrong, Claire's hands began to shake violently. She leaned across the table, lowering her voice to a terrified whisper. Claire confessed that someone was actively following her. She explained that after leaving the grocery store the previous afternoon, she had heard heavy, deliberate footsteps walking directly behind her in the parking lot. When she stopped walking, the footsteps stopped. When she turned around, she saw the silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered man quickly ducking behind a parked van. Maggie begged Claire to let Ethan use his badge to completely lock down their neighborhood. Claire promised she would sit down with Ethan that very weekend and demand a full, formal police investigation into the stalking. But that weekend absolutely never came. On a quiet, overcast Thursday evening in the late autumn of 1995, the heavy, suffocating dread finally materialized into absolute horror. Claire finished her shift at the county courthouse archives at exactly 5 o'clock. She waved goodbye to her coworkers, put on her light autumn jacket, and walked out to her dark blue sedan in the courthouse parking lot. She had promised Ethan she would pick up a few things for dinner and be home by 6. At 6:30, the house was still completely empty. Ethan was sitting on the living room sofa, staring at the clock on the wall. A deep, heavy knot began to form in the absolute bottom of his stomach. Claire was a woman of fierce punctuality. She never, ever ran late without calling the landline. By 7 o'clock, the knot of worry had entirely transformed into a massive, suffocating wave of pure, primal panic. Ethan picked up his police radio and called the central dispatch. He requested a routine check on the main roads leading from the courthouse. Desperately hopping her car had simply broken down with a flat tire. 20 agonizing minutes later, Ethan's police radio suddenly crackled to life. The voice of the dispatcher was incredibly tense. She told Ethan that a county sheriff's deputy had just located a dark blue sedan matching Claire's license plate. The car was parked awkwardly on the gravel shoulder of Miller Road, a deeply isolated, heavily wooded county highway that completely bypassed the main town. It was a route Claire occasionally took to enjoy the autumn leaves, but it was incredibly remote. Ethan did not wait for further details. He grabbed his heavy police jacket, threw himself into his cruiser, and aggressively sped toward Miller Road, the sirens blaring wildly into the freezing night air. When Ethan arrived at the scene, the darkness of the rural highway was completely illuminated by the flashing red and blue strobes of 2 county police cruisers. Ethan slammed his vehicle into park and ran desperately toward the dark blue sedan. He didn't approach the vehicle as a trained investigator. He ran to it as a terrified, desperate husband. He shined his heavy tactical flashlight through the driver's side window. The car was entirely empty. But the scene inside the vehicle created a massive, incredibly terrifying psychological contradiction that completely paralyzed Ethan's mind. The driver's side door was entirely unlocked. The silver keys were still perfectly sitting in the ignition. The engine was completely turned off. Resting exactly in the center of the passenger seat was Claire's heavy leather purse. Ethan opened the passenger door and frantically dug through the purse. Her wallet was there. Her cash was entirely untouched. There was absolutely no shattered glass. There were no deep tire marks in the mud to indicate her car had been forced off the road. There was absolutely no sign of a violent, chaotic struggle. It did not look like a violent abduction. It looked exactly as if Claire had simply pulled her car over, put the transmission in park, and completely vanished into the freezing, dark woods on her own accord. But Ethan knew his wife. A deeply organized, highly responsible woman does not walk away from her vehicle on a freezing, isolated road, leaving her purse in plain sight and the keys in the ignition. It completely defied every single human instinct. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Within an hour, the quiet county road was swarming with heavy law enforcement presence. The state police established a massive command center directly on the wet asphalt. Tracking dogs were brought in, their handlers desperately trying to find a scent trail leading into the dense, towering pine trees. Ethan stood near the edge of the dark woods, the freezing rain beginning to fall heavily against his face. He watched his fellow officers stringing yellow crime scene tape around his wife's car. A massive, deeply horrifying realization slowly washed completely over him. The stalking, the silent phone calls, the unfamiliar truck in the neighborhood, it had all been leading up to this exact moment. And as Ethan stared into the pitch-black darkness of the tree line, the chilling, heavily whispered voice of the violent offender he had arrested months ago began to loudly, violently echo in his mind. One day, you'll know what it's like to lose absolutely everything. Ethan realized with absolute, terrifying certainty that the monster sitting in a concrete prison cell had somehow reached through the steel bars and stolen his wife. But how could a man locked in maximum security completely orchestrate a flawless, invisible abduction? The very next morning, the entire Ridgewood Police Department completely mobilized. The absolute, unyielding loyalty of the badge meant that, when an officer's family was attacked, the entire force responded with a massive, terrifying intensity. Two senior detectives, heavily armed and burning with a fierce, unstoppable anger, drove directly to the maximum security state penitentiary where Ray Nolan was securely locked away. They demanded absolute, completely unrestricted access to the prison's internal security logs, the visitor registry, and the recorded telephone tapes. They were entirely convinced that Ray had used a smuggled cellular phone or a highly coordinated prison visitor to organize the abduction of Ethan's wife. But as the detectives spent hours aggressively tearing through the official prison archives, they hit a massive, completely inexplicable brick wall. The heavy, typed security logs showed that Ray Nolan had never left his concrete cell, except for heavily supervised, solitary recreation hours. He had absolutely no approved visitors since the day he was incarcerated. He had made 0 outgoing telephone calls. The prison was completely locked down, and Ray's strict isolation protocols were flawlessly documented. Furious and desperate, the detectives forced the prison warden to pull Ray Nolan out of his cell for an immediate, official interrogation. Ray was dragged into the cold, sterile, concrete interview room. He was wearing a bright orange prison uniform, his wrists and ankles secured by heavy, rattling steel chains. The detective slammed photographs of Claire's abandoned blue sedan onto the metal table, screaming at the violent offender, aggressively demanding to know exactly who he had hired to take her. Ray did not flinch. He did not look intimidated by the furious detectives. He simply leaned back in his hard metal chair, staring down at the glossy photographs of the crime scene. Slowly, a deeply chilling, highly arrogant smile crept across his weathered face. He looked directly up into the two-way mirror, completely aware that Ethan was likely standing on the other side of the glass. "I told the sergeant exactly what was going to happen," Ray said, his voice entirely calm and deeply smug. "And I kept my promise without leaving my cell." That single, terrifying sentence completely haunted the investigators for years. Ray was officially claiming absolute responsibility for the devastating crime, while simultaneously hiding behind an unbreakable, completely documented institutional alibi. He was openly mocking the police, fully aware that they had absolutely no physical evidence to tie him to the dark woods of Miller Road. Without a confession or a proxy suspect to arrest, the detectives were entirely forced to leave the prison empty-handed. The massive, highly coordinated search for Claire Walker violently escalated. The local police, assisted by heavily armed state troopers and hundreds of dedicated civilian volunteers, established a 10-mile search grid, completely surrounding the abandoned vehicle. They brought in highly trained tracking dogs to scour the deep ravines and the thick, overgrown brush of the Appalachian foothills. Local fire departments used heavy grappling hooks to drag the freezing, murky waters of the nearby county lakes. Ethan refused to go home. He completely stopped sleeping. He spent his days marching shoulder to shoulder with the search teams, tearing through the heavy, thorny brush until his hands were completely covered in bleeding scratches. He screamed his wife's name into the freezing autumn wind until his vocal cords were entirely shredded. But the thick, unforgiving forest yielded absolutely nothing. There was no torn clothing, no lost shoes, and no physical trace of the beautiful, highly organized woman who had completely vanished from the earth. However, on the 14th day of the grueling search, a volunteer walking through a deep, muddy drainage ditch nearly 4 miles away from the abandoned car made a highly bizarre, completely unexpected discovery. Resting half-buried in the freezing mud was a small, heavy rectangular object made of thick black plastic. The volunteer immediately flagged down a state trooper, and the object was carefully placed into a clear plastic evidence bag. When Ethan looked at the object back at the command center, a massive, sickening wave of absolute confusion crashed over his mind. It was a battery, but it was not a standard car battery or a flashlight battery. It was a heavy-duty, highly specific, rechargeable nickel-cadmium battery block explicitly designed to attach to the bottom of a law enforcement handheld radio. The discovery was incredibly strange. Why was a piece of heavy police communication equipment lying completely abandoned in a muddy ditch miles away from the actual crime scene? None of the officers working the search grid reported losing a radio battery. The object felt deeply out of place, like a random puzzle piece entirely belonging to a completely different picture. The forensic technicians aggressively dusted the battery for fingerprints, but the heavy autumn rain and the freezing mud had completely washed the plastic clean. With absolutely no way to trace the specific serial number on the battery casing back to a specific officer, the strange clue was officially logged into evidence, placed inside a heavy cardboard box, and quietly filed away in the dark archives of the precinct. As the bitter, freezing winter snows began to heavily cover the town of Ridgewood, the massive momentum of the investigation slowly, tragically collapsed. The state police officially withdrew their heavy resources, transferring the detectives back to active homicide cases in the larger cities. The bright yellow missing person flyers taped to the storefronts slowly began to peel and fade. The terrifying reality of a cold case finally, completely settled over Ethan Walker. The emotional devastation completely destroyed him. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to solving crimes and bringing absolute justice to his community. But he had entirely failed to protect his own wife. Ethan slowly transformed into a ghost. He emotionally divorced himself from absolutely everyone around him. He completely stopped attending neighborhood barbecues. He stopped speaking with his old friends on the force, and he lived completely alone in the quiet suburban house he had once shared with Claire. A few years later, unable to bear the heavy, suffocating weight of wearing the uniform, Ethan officially requested an early retirement from the police department. He packed his shiny silver badge into a small wooden box and completely walked away from his career. But he never, ever stopped searching for her. Ethan converted his small guest bedroom into a massive, highly detailed command center. The walls were completely covered with topographical maps, heavy red string, and hundreds of crime scene photographs. He spent every single waking hour aggressively reviewing the old case files, analyzing Ray Nolan's prison records, and driving down the dark, isolated stretches of Miller Road in the middle of the night. He was completely trapped in a relentless, agonizing purgatory, endlessly searching for a woman the entire world had already forgotten. Years slowly turned into a decade. The 1990s faded entirely into history, completely replaced by the highly modern era of the 2000s. The small police department heavily upgraded its technology, replacing the old, analog handheld radios with modern, encrypted digital communication systems. The town of Ridgewood completely changed, filled with new officers who had absolutely no memory of the brilliant records archivist who had vanished in the dark. 18 long, agonizing years passed. It was now the late autumn of 2013. Ethan was now a deeply weathered, heavily grayed man in his early 50s. The heavy exhaustion of nearly 2 decades of absolute heartbreak was permanently etched into the deep lines of his face. The trail had gone completely, entirely cold. But in the world of cold cases, the most massive, terrifying breakthroughs rarely come from a highly planned investigation. They almost always come from a completely random, incredibly ordinary mistake. On a quiet, overcast Tuesday afternoon, a young, newly hired county deputy named Mark Collins was on a routine patrol near the extreme, rural edge of the county border. Mark was only 23 years old. He had absolutely no idea who Ethan Walker was, and he was entirely unfamiliar with the tragic history of the 1995 disappearance. Deputy Collins received a routine, highly mundane call from the Central Dispatch. A local farmer had reported seeing a group of trespassing teenagers heavily drinking and completely vandalizing an old, deeply isolated, abandoned farmhouse sitting at the end of a heavily overgrown dirt road. Collins turned his cruiser down the muddy path and parked near the rotting wooden porch of the massive, decaying property. The house had been completely empty for decades. The windows were entirely shattered, and thick, heavy ivy was violently crawling up the faded white siding. The teenagers had already fled the scene, leaving behind a massive pile of empty beer cans and broken glass on the front porch. Collins unclipped his heavy tactical flashlight and carefully walked into the dark, echoing structure to ensure the property was completely clear. The air inside the abandoned farmhouse smelled heavily of rotting wood, damp earth, and severe decay. Collins slowly walked through the ruined living room, his bright white flashlight cutting through the thick clouds of dust dancing in the air. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. As Deputy Collins stepped heavily into what used to be the formal dining room, the toe of his heavy tactical boot caught violently against a heavily warped, completely loose wooden floorboard. Collins stumbled slightly, looking down at the dark, rotting oak floor. The specific floorboard was not just warped by the intense humidity. It looked exactly as if it had been intentionally, aggressively pried up and hastily placed back down. The heavy iron nails were completely missing from the edges. Driven entirely by basic police curiosity, Collins knelt down on the dusty floor. He wedged his heavy metal flashlight under the edge of the rotting wood and aggressively pulled the floorboard up. He shined his light directly down into the dark, incredibly narrow gap between the wooden floor and the dirt foundation. Resting quietly in the absolute darkness, heavily covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust, was a completely unexpected object. Collins carefully reached down into the hole and pulled the heavy object out into the dim light. It was a bulky, heavily outdated analog police handheld radio. The device was completely obsolete, the exact heavy black plastic model that the local police department used back in the mid-1990s before the massive digital upgrade. The radio looked exactly as if it had been quietly placed into the dark hole and completely untouched for nearly 2 decades. Deputy Collins stood up, deeply confused by the highly bizarre discovery. Why would a piece of official, expensive police communication equipment be completely hidden beneath the floorboards of a rotting, abandoned farmhouse? Collins pulled his modern digital radio from his belt to call the discovery into dispatch. But before he could press the heavy transmit button, his thumb casually brushed against the old, dusty volume knob sitting on the top of the abandoned radio in his other hand. The knob clicked softly. Instantly, a heavy, violently loud burst of harsh, crackling white static completely exploded from the speaker of the 18-year-old radio, shattering the absolute silence of the abandoned house. The harsh, violently loud burst of white static completely shattered the absolute, suffocating silence of the abandoned farmhouse. Deputy Mark Collins jumped back in shock, nearly dropping the heavy, outdated police radio onto the dusty floorboards. The sudden noise was completely unexpected. A device that had been hidden in the dirt for nearly 2 decades should have been entirely dead. The loud static hissed and crackled through the small, aged speaker for several seconds. And then, completely piercing through the heavy electronic interference, a voice suddenly broke through the transmission. It was a weak, incredibly fragmented voice. It sounded deeply distant, heavily distorted by the 18 years of rust and decaying circuitry. The voice spoke only a few frantic, breathless syllables, desperately trying to transmit a message through the static, before the signal violently cut out, plunging the abandoned dining room back into absolute, heavy silence. Deputy Collins stood completely frozen, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his chest. He immediately grabbed his modern digital shoulder microphone and called the bizarre incident into the central dispatch, reporting that he had just received a stray transmission on an obsolete analog frequency. The dispatcher on duty simply laughed it off. She assured the young deputy that it was just a random burst of radio interference, likely bleed over from a local ham radio operator or an old trucking frequency. She told him to bag the junk radio and bring it back to the precinct for disposal. But when Collins placed the heavy black radio onto the primary evidence desk at the police station later that afternoon, a senior detective happened to be walking by. The older detective recognized the massive, blocky shape of the mid-1990s equipment immediately. He asked the young deputy to pull the digital recording of his body microphone, which had successfully captured the brief, strange radio transmission inside the farmhouse. The senior detective listened to the recording. He didn't laugh it off as interference. He immediately picked up his cellular phone and dialed the number of a man who had spent the last 18 years living completely as a ghost. 30 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the police precinct pushed open. Ethan Walker walked slowly into the building. He looked deeply weathered, his shoulders carrying the absolute, crushing weight of nearly 2 decades of unrelenting grief. The young officers in the room quietly stepped aside, showing profound respect for the tragic, legendary former sergeant. Ethan sat down at the wooden evidence desk. The senior detective pressed play on the digital audio recorder. The loud, hissing static filled the quiet room, and then the weak, fragmented voice briefly broke through the noise. Ethan completely stopped breathing. The blood entirely drained from his heavily lined face. He grabbed the edge of the wooden desk, his hands shaking with a sudden, violent intensity. The young deputy assumed it was just a random voice, but Ethan's brilliant, highly observant mind had spent 18 years desperately holding onto every single memory of his wife. He knew the exact cadence of her breathing. He knew the specific, unique pitch of her terrified voice. It wasn't a random trucker, and it wasn't just interference. Something about the terrified, desperate tone of the voice stopped Ethan entirely cold. It sounded exactly like an old, phantom echo of Claire, permanently trapped in the analog radio waves, desperately trying to reach him from the dark. Ethan demanded that the radio be completely processed by the most advanced forensic technicians in the state. The evidence team immediately went to work. The very first thing they checked was the deeply faded, engraved serial number located on the heavy plastic casing of the radio. They ran the sequence through the massive, digitized archives of the police department's inventory system. The computer generated a massive, completely terrifying red flag. The serial number absolutely confirmed that the radio belonged to the Ridgewood Police Department. It had been officially assigned to the tactical unit in the early 1990s. But the official records contained a massive, impossible contradiction. According to the quartermaster logs, that specific radio had been heavily damaged and officially destroyed in a municipal incinerator in 1998. The paperwork was signed, stamped, and completely finalized. But the radio had not been destroyed. It had been carefully hidden beneath the floorboards of an abandoned farmhouse. A heavy, sickening chill washed completely over Ethan. A random violent offender like Ray Nolan could not access the secure police quartermaster logs. Someone deeply embedded inside the police department had deliberately, flawlessly falsified the official records to cover up the existence of the radio. The massive, terrifying betrayal began to slowly reveal itself. The threat had not just come from the streets. It had come from directly inside the house. The forensic technicians carefully dismantled the heavy plastic casing of the radio. The exterior had been completely wiped clean by 18 years of heavy dust and changing temperatures. But as they gently removed the internal circuitry board, completely protected from the elements deep inside the casing, they found a single, flawless, highly preserved fingerprint pressed directly against the green motherboard. The fingerprint was instantly scanned and uploaded into the modern, highly advanced national database. The investigative team held their breath, waiting for the computer to match the print to Ray Nolan. But when the bright screen finally flashed with a confirmed identity, the result completely shattered their entire understanding of the 1995 disappearance. The fingerprint did not belong to Claire, and it absolutely did not belong to Ray Nolan. The print belonged to a man named Gregory Dunn. Ethan stared at the name on the computer screen, completely paralyzed by the horrifying implication. Gregory Dunn was not a police officer. He was not a local criminal. Gregory Dunn had been a senior corrections officer working at the maximum security state penitentiary in 1995. He had worked in the exact same massive, concrete prison, where Ray Nolan was securely locked away. Dunn had officially died of a massive heart attack nearly 10 years ago, completely taking his dark secrets to the grave. But his single, perfect fingerprint permanently tied the hidden police radio directly to the maximum security prison. Ethan did not wait for official warrants. He partnered with the senior detective, and they drove aggressively across the state, pulling directly into the massive, heavily fortified gates of the state penitentiary. They bypassed the warden's office entirely and marched directly into the deep, subterranean concrete archives of the prison. The room was heavily packed with massive, dusty rows of old filing cabinets. They demanded the original, handwritten transportation and security logs from the spring of 1995. The prison archivist pulled the heavy, leather-bound logbooks from the shelves and placed them onto a metal table. Ethan frantically flipped through the thick, aging pages, desperately tracing the dates leading up to the exact week Claire had completely vanished. When he reached the page for that specific week, his heart completely stopped beating. The pages were gone. They had not been misplaced. They had been violently, aggressively torn completely out of the heavy binding. The jagged, torn edges of the thick paper were still visible near the spine. Entire weeks of official prison movements, cell checks, and transportation logs had completely disappeared into an absolute black hole. The pristine, completely documented institutional alibi that Ray Nolan had arrogantly hidden behind for 18 years was built entirely on a massive, highly coordinated lie. But missing pages were not enough to secure a conviction. Ethan knew they desperately needed a human witness who could actually explain exactly what was happening inside the dark, concrete walls of the prison in 1995. They began heavily tracking down former prison staff who had worked the overnight shifts alongside Gregory Dunn. Most of the older guards completely refused to speak, heavily intimidated by the old, unspoken code of silence. But finally, they located a retired prison nurse named Helen. She was now in her late 70s, living quietly in a small assisted care facility on the edge of the city. Ethan walked gently into her small, sunlit room. He sat down in a chair next to her bed. He didn't interrogate her like a suspect. He spoke to her exactly like a grieving, completely broken husband. He told her about Claire. He described her warm smile, her brilliant mind, and the 18 years of absolute, agonizing nightmare he had endured. Helen looked at the tears heavily standing in the old police officer's eyes. Her conscience, heavily burdened by nearly 2 decades of silent guilt, finally broke. Helen asked the active detective to step out of the room, leaving her completely alone with Ethan. She spoke in a quiet, deeply terrified whisper. She confessed that the official prison logs were an absolute, terrifying joke. She explained that in the mid-1990s, a highly corrupt ring of senior guards, heavily led by Gregory Dunn, had operated a massive, incredibly lucrative shadow operation completely off the books. They called them special jobs, Helen whispered, her hands shaking violently as she gripped her blanket. In the absolute dead of night, they would quietly open the cells of the most violent, dangerous inmates. They would put them in unmarked, blacked-out transport vans and drive them completely off the prison property. Ethan listened, completely horrified, as the retired nurse explained that the inmates were used as untraceable, anonymous muscle. They were rented out to highly powerful, corrupt individuals on the outside who needed violent enforcement, severe intimidation, or specialized crimes committed without leaving a single trace. Because the inmates were officially logged as sleeping in their concrete cells, they had an absolutely flawless, unbreakable alibi. Helen looked directly into Ethan's eyes, the heavy tears spilling completely over her wrinkled cheeks. Ray Nolan was their absolute favorite, Helen cried softly. He went out on the special jobs all the time. He was completely out of his cell on the night your wife vanished. I knew it. But I was so terrified of what they would do to my family if I ever spoke a word. I am so deeply sorry. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. The confession completely obliterated the massive, impenetrable wall that had stopped the investigation 18 years ago. Ray Nolan's smug, arrogant smile in the interrogation room had been completely genuine, because he knew the corrupt guards had flawlessly erased his movements from the record. He had successfully kept his terrifying promise to Ethan. He had been quietly released into the dark night, tracked Claire's vehicle down the isolated county road, and completely stolen her from the world, all while officially sitting behind heavy steel bars. But as Ethan drove slowly back to Ridgewood, the massive, sickening puzzle began to rapidly expand into something far more terrifying than a simple act of criminal revenge. Ray Nolan was a violent, impulsive thug. He was not a criminal mastermind. He absolutely did not have the massive financial resources required to bribe a massive ring of corrupt prison guards. And he certainly did not have the highly classified internal police access required to falsify quartermaster logs and orchestrate a secret communication network using stolen police radios. Ray Nolan had simply been the muscle. He was a terrifying, violent puppet operating on the end of a very long, highly invisible string. Someone else had completely paid for the corrupt guards. Someone else had provided the hidden police radio so they could safely communicate during the abduction. Someone else with massive, completely terrifying institutional power had orchestrated the entire, flawless nightmare. Ethan realized with absolute, bone-chilling certainty that Ray Nolan had never planned to completely orchestrate the kidnapping on his own. The real monster, the architect of the entire 18-year conspiracy, was hiding completely in plain sight, protected entirely by a silver badge and a flawless reputation. The hunt for Claire's killer was no longer a simple search for a violent criminal. It was a massive, highly dangerous war against a completely invisible enemy hidden deeply inside the exact same police department Ethan had trusted with his entire life. The terrifying realization that Claire's disappearance had been entirely orchestrated from inside his own police department completely fundamentally shattered Ethan Walker's entire worldview. He sat in the secure conference room of the state police headquarters, staring blankly at the dark wall. The man who had worn a silver badge with absolute, unwavering pride for decades suddenly realized that the uniform he loved had been used as a flawless, invisible shield to completely destroy his life. Ray Nolan was a brutal, violent thug, but he was absolutely not a criminal mastermind. He did not have the massive, deeply complex logistical capability to falsify secure quartermaster logs, steal police radios, and bribe a ring of maximum security prison guards. Ray had simply been a blunt instrument. To completely unmask the invisible architect, the state police investigators aggressively pivoted their massive resources away from the physical crime scene and directly into the hidden financial records of 1995. They needed to find exactly who had paid for Ray Nolan's secret release. A team of highly specialized forensic accountants spent weeks tearing through heavily archived, decades-old bank statements. They completely audited the financial history of Ray Nolan's immediate family. They quickly discovered a massive, completely undeniable anomaly. Just 3 weeks after Claire vanished, Ray Nolan's wife, who had been heavily struggling to pay her basic utility bills, suddenly began receiving massive, untraceable cash deposits. Over the course of 6 months, tens of thousands of dollars were quietly moved into her small checking account. The forensic accountants aggressively followed the digital paper trail backward. They traced the massive cash payments through a deeply complex maze of anonymous shell corporations and fake landscaping companies. Finally, the trail ended at a single, highly recognizable name. The holding accounts belonged to a prominent, deeply respected local businessman in Ridgewood. He was a man who owned several large construction firms and, most terrifyingly, was incredibly famous for his massive financial donations to the local police union. He frequently hosted private charity golf tournaments and deeply exclusive dinners for the senior commanders of the police department. He was incredibly close friends with the highest-ranking officers in town. But as investigators pulled the businessman into a secure, windowless interrogation room, the entire narrative violently shifted again. The businessman was completely terrified of going to federal prison. He immediately broke down and confessed that he had absolutely nothing to do with kidnapping Claire. He admitted he was simply the financial launderer for a massive, highly organized ring of deeply corrupt police officers. He explained that the corrupt officers had originally hired Ray Nolan through the dirty prison guards for a much smaller job. Ray's original instructions had simply been to quietly stalk Claire, park outside their house, and make the silent phone calls. They just wanted to completely terrify Ethan, distracting the sharp, brilliant patrol sergeant so he wouldn't look too closely at what his fellow officers were doing in the dark. But then the businessman confessed something went completely, horribly wrong. The corrupt officers suddenly panicked. They realized that Ethan was not the real threat. The real threat was Claire. Ethan sat in the observation room, listening to the businessman's confession through the heavy speaker. His brilliant, analytical mind began aggressively tearing the past apart, desperately trying to understand how his quiet, beautiful wife had become the primary target of a massive police corruption ring. He suddenly remembered exactly what Claire did for a living. She was a senior records archivist at the county courthouse. She managed the massive, continuous chain of custody for absolutely every single piece of physical evidence, impounded vehicle, and seized cash that the police department submitted for trial. Ethan immediately left the precinct and drove aggressively back to his quiet suburban house. He walked directly into his massive, highly organized guest bedroom command center. Sitting in the very back of the closet, completely covered in 18 years of heavy dust, was a single, sealed cardboard storage box. After Claire had vanished, Ethan's friends had packed up her small office at the courthouse and dropped the box off at his house. The overwhelming, suffocating grief had made it completely impossible for Ethan to open it. It had remained entirely untouched since 1995. Ethan pulled the heavy box into the center of the room. His hands were shaking violently as he used a pocket knife to slice through the yellowed packing tape. He slowly pulled out her old desk calendar, her favorite coffee mug, and her heavily organized file folders. But resting at the absolute bottom of the box was a thick, dark blue spiral notebook. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was Claire's personal archivist ledger, the book she used to quietly track discrepancies in the massive evidence room. He opened the heavy cover and began slowly turning the pages. The handwriting was immaculate and highly detailed. Claire had been quietly, meticulously tracking a massive, deeply horrifying pattern. She had documented dozens of cases where massive amounts of seized narcotics cash had quietly gone completely missing from the evidence locker before trial. She had tracked illegal property seizures and completely fabricated police reports designed to cover up the massive, systemic theft. But as Ethan reached the final pages of the notebook, a massive, sickening wave of absolute horror washed completely over him. The pages covering the exact month she vanished were completely gone. They had not fallen out. They had been violently, aggressively torn completely out of the heavy wire binding. The jagged, shredded edges of the paper were still clearly visible near the spine. Whoever had packed up her office after she disappeared had deliberately, flawlessly sterilized her notebook. They knew exactly what they were looking for. The heartbreaking, devastating truth finally completely settled over Ethan. Claire had uncovered the massive corruption ring entirely on her own. She had seen the missing cash and the fake reports. But because she was deeply brilliant and fiercely protective, she had never told Ethan. She knew that her husband was an incredibly honest, deeply loyal police officer. If she had told him without having absolute, undeniable physical proof, Ethan would have immediately confronted his fellow officers, placing his own life in massive, immediate danger. Claire had stayed completely silent, quietly gathering the dangerous evidence entirely on her own, desperately trying to protect her husband. She had unknowingly become a massive, existential threat to the corrupt officers, And when they realized she was secretly building a flawless dossier that would send them all to federal prison, they changed Ray Nolan's instructions. They ordered the violent criminal to permanently silence her. Armed with the undeniable proof of the stolen evidence, the state police investigators aggressively widened their massive net. They needed to know exactly how the corrupt officers had coordinated the radio silence on the night Claire vanished. They heavily subpoenaed the retired dispatchers, who had worked the evening shift in the autumn of 1995. A state police detective sat down in the quiet living room of a 65-year-old woman named Brenda. Brenda had been the senior radio dispatcher on duty the exact evening Claire's blue sedan was found abandoned on Miller Road. When the detective gently brought up the night of the disappearance, Brenda completely broke down. The heavy tears openly flooded her eyes, her shoulders shaking with a profound, suffocating guilt she had carried in absolute silence for 18 long years. Brenda confessed a deeply terrifying secret. She explained that on that specific evening, she was sitting alone at the massive radio console. Suddenly, a deeply frantic, highly terrifying transmission had broken through the secure, encrypted tactical channel. It was a woman's voice, screaming in absolute primal terror, desperately begging for Ethan. Brenda had immediately reached for her microphone to respond and trace the transmission. But before she could press the heavy button, her shift supervisor had aggressively grabbed her wrist. He had looked her directly in the eyes with absolute, chilling malice and coldly ordered her to entirely ignore the call. He then leaned over the massive recording console and manually, deliberately erased the heavy analog magnetic tape that was actively recording the channel. He threatened Brenda that if she ever spoke a single word about the transmission, she would be completely destroyed. Brenda had obeyed the terrifying order. She had stayed completely silent while Ethan spent years desperately searching the woods. But Brenda was not a completely broken woman. She confessed to the detective that although she had allowed the supervisor to erase the primary reel, the old dispatch system automatically ran a highly degraded, heavily compressed secondary backup tape on a separate machine in the basement. Brenda had secretly stolen the damaged backup tape before she retired. She had kept it completely hidden in an old shoebox in her attic for nearly 2 decades, deeply terrified to show it to anyone, but entirely unable to throw it away. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. The state police audio specialists took immediate, heavily guarded possession of the fragile, 18-year-old magnetic tape. They brought it directly to a massive, highly advanced acoustic forensics laboratory. Ethan stood in the soundproof observation room, his heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against his ribs. The audio engineers spent 24 grueling hours carefully splicing the decaying tape, running the degraded audio through massive digital filters to completely strip away the heavy, hissing static. Finally, the lead engineer signaled that they had recovered a fragment. He pressed a button on the heavy soundboard. The quiet room was completely filled with the terrifying, hissing sound of old analog static. And then, entirely breaking through the noise, was the terrified, breathless voice of Claire Walker. "Ethan, please, they're taking me down, near the old limestone." The transmission violently cut off, swallowed entirely by the heavy white static. Ethan collapsed heavily into a metal chair, burying his face in his hands, completely overwhelmed by the raw, agonizing sound of his wife's final, desperate cry for help. But as the heavy, fragmented words echoed in his mind, his brilliant, highly analytical memory completely snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. The old police radios they used in 1995 had an incredibly limited range. The only way Claire could have transmitted a signal directly to the secure tactical channel from the stolen radio was if she was in close physical proximity to a massive, high-powered signal repeater tower. Ethan stood up, his eyes burning with a fierce, unstoppable realization. "The old limestone," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with a massive surge of pure adrenaline. He aggressively threw a large topographical map of the county onto the table. He pointed directly to a highly isolated, deeply remote section of land located on the extreme western border of the county, nearly 30 miles away from where her blue sedan had been completely abandoned. In the mid-1990s, there was a massive, completely abandoned limestone quarry located in that exact area. And most importantly, towering directly above the deep, jagged cliffs of the quarry was the county's primary, high-powered radio repeater tower. The corrupt officers had intentionally dumped Claire's car on Miller Road to create a massive, completely false search grid, completely drawing the entire police force miles away in the wrong direction. The real nightmare had happened deep underground, completely hidden in the absolute darkness of the abandoned limestone quarry. Within 2 hours, a massive convoy of heavily armored state police vehicles, specialized search and rescue teams, and federal tactical units drove aggressively toward the western border of the county. They arrived at the massive, decaying gates of the abandoned limestone quarry just as the heavy, freezing rain began to fall. The sprawling, deeply isolated property was heavily overgrown with thick, thorny brush and completely surrounded by deep, dangerous drops into the flooded rock pits. Ethan marched shoulder to shoulder with the tactical teams, his heavy flashlight cutting through the dense, freezing fog rolling off the dark water. They scoured the decaying, rusted heavy machinery and the collapsed wooden processing buildings. They searched the area for hours, finding absolutely nothing but rusted metal and decaying wood. But as the search teams moved deeper into the massive property, a state trooper shined his bright light toward the absolute base of a towering, jagged rock wall. Completely hidden behind a thick wall of dead brush was a heavy, rusted steel door. It was an old, deeply isolated underground maintenance tunnel that had been used by the quarry workers decades ago to transport explosives. The entrance had been completely omitted from the modern county maps. The tactical team used heavy hydraulic cutters to violently snap the thick, rusted chains securing the heavy steel doors. They pulled the doors open, releasing a heavy, suffocating wave of freezing, stale air that smelled deeply of damp earth and severe decay. Ethan and the heavily armed troopers slowly walked down into the pitch-black darkness of the concrete tunnel, their bright white flashlights cutting through the heavy dust. The massive underground corridor stretched for hundreds of feet into the absolute dark. It was completely empty. But as Ethan walked slowly along the cold, damp concrete floor, shining his heavy light along the jagged edges of the walls, he noticed something highly unusual. Near the very back of the tunnel, a small, heavy chunk of broken concrete had been completely dislodged from the ceiling and was resting awkwardly on the dusty floor. Driven entirely by the same sharp, deeply analytical instinct that had defined his entire career, Ethan knelt down on the cold floor. He carefully rolled the heavy, broken chunk of concrete over. Resting quietly in the thick gray dust, completely hidden from casual view, was a tiny, incredibly distinct object. Ethan's breathing completely stopped. His hands shook violently as he reached down and gently picked the object up into the bright beam of his flashlight. It was a small, delicate gold band. Ethan pulled his flashlight closer, his eyes completely flooding with heavy, burning tears. Engraved deeply into the inside of the gold band was a tiny, unmistakable inscription. E&C forever. It was Claire's wedding ring. A massive, overwhelming wave of profound devastation and absolute awe completely crashed over Ethan. Claire had not simply dropped the ring in a struggle. She had deliberately, carefully wedged it beneath the heavy piece of broken concrete. Even in the absolute darkest, most terrifying moments of her life, completely trapped in an underground tunnel surrounded by monsters. The brilliant archivist had never stopped fighting. She had deliberately left a permanent, undeniable physical marker. She knew that one day, no matter how many years it took, Ethan would never stop searching, and he would eventually find the tunnel. The gold ring was absolute, undeniable physical proof that she had been held captive in the dark concrete corridor. But the tunnel was completely empty. Claire was gone. The corrupt officers were gone. Ethan stood up in the freezing darkness of the underground tunnel, gripping the gold wedding ring tightly in his fist. The massive, invisible walls of the 18-year-old conspiracy were rapidly, violently collapsing. The investigators had the massive financial records, they had the recovered dispatch audio, and they had absolute proof of the hidden location. The state police were closing the massive steel trap, but there was still one terrifying, unanswered question remaining in the dark. They had to find out the absolute exact identity of the senior officer wearing the silver badge who had completely orchestrated the nightmare and given the final, fatal command.